Hello Grade 8s and welcome to the Answer Series Natural Sciences videos based on our study guides. So in this video we're going to take everything we've learned in the previous 9 videos and put it together in an application type question, which is basically a scientific investigation. And this investigation will contain content on both photosynthesis and respiration. So you have to remember what you've learned in order to apply it to an unknown context. Now the question I'll be working through is maybe a little bit higher order in places for grade 8, but it's important to expose yourself to experimental questions of this kind so that we can get those brain juices flowing and we can see the links between the content that we've studied. So when you're confronted with a scientific investigation in exams, don't be concerned or intimidated by it. Nothing is going to be too hard if you take the time to first understand the information provided to you. So let's see if you can do this investigation. And again, some questions are going to be easier than others, and it's good practice for you, even though it might not be something you would see in your particular exam. Right, so here we have our scientific investigation. And immediately you might be taken aback because, sure, there are quite a number of test tubes and it looks a little bit intimidating. But let's unpack the information provided and take it step by step. So this is always the first step we take. We read the stem of the question, we look at what has been provided, and we think about the consequences of our experiment. And then only do we worry about what they're asking us in the specific questions, because by that time, we've most likely actually answered some of the questions already. So the stem of the question says, the diagrams below show the apparatus setups used during an investigation to determine if living organisms release carbon dioxide during respiration. So importantly, this investigation has an aim to determine if living organisms release carbon dioxide during respiration. And that should be a familiar aim to you because we've done an investigation in our previous video on how to test for the presence of carbon dioxide. Then it says that the investigation was conducted in the light, which is an important statement because it means that all the test tubes were exposed to light. And you have to keep that in mind because photosynthesis uses light, but respiration does not. Test tubes 3 and 5, however, were covered with black paper. So even though the whole setup is still exposed to light, you can see that these test tubes have a black film around them so that the content of the test tube will all be in the dark. Okay, so let's look at these test tubes individually, and we have 5 of them. First, let's focus on their commonalities. All 5 test tubes are the same size. All of them have a cork stopper of the same size. And all of them have a permeable wire mesh in the center, where permeable here means that it allows gases to move up and down through it. Something can move through a permeable barrier. And then lastly, all of them have clear lime water in, and it also seems that the clear lime water is the same amount in each of the test tubes. Now let's look at their differences. So test tube 1 has nothing inside of it except the clear lime water. Test tube 2 has 2 beetles, in other words 2 animals inside of it. Test tube 3, which is covered by a black film or black paper, has beetles and a plant in it. Test tube 4 has a plant in it, and test tube 5, which is covered with a black paper, also has a single plant in it. So you've already kind of understood the setup, we've unpacked it. We're basically looking at plants and animals, and as the aim says, we're looking at the release of carbon dioxide from these plants and animals because we have clear lime water to indicate that during respiration. But there are some of the test tubes here that might be performing photosynthesis, which is not what we're investigating, and that could be a problem for our investigative setup. Okay, so I'm going to put up the first 5 questions. Pause the video here, try your best to answer the questions, and then we'll work through them together. Question 1. Provide the aim for this investigation. So we've already done this, but just remember that whenever you're confronted with a question regarding the aim, you go to the stem of your question and you look for a phrase that starts with the word to. For example, to show, to investigate, or to determine. So that to, that word, starts our aim, because it's like someone asking you, what do you want to do? And you answer, I want to. That is how you state an aim. So here the investigator wants to determine if living organisms release carbon dioxide during respiration. And you just copy and paste that into your answer. That is your aim. Question 2. Identify the dependent variable for this investigation. Now, in order to do this, we have to look at the aim that we've just written down. A dependent variable is always the thing that we are measuring. It depends on what we manipulate. So if we look at our aim, we want to determine if carbon dioxide is released. And the clear lime water is here to measure the release of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide's release is our dependent variable. It depends on whether there are living organisms to perform the respiration. So the living organisms and the respiration that they're performing is our independent variable, because we are manipulating whether respiration occurs inside each test tube by adding or removing living organisms. So the release of carbon dioxide depends on whether there are living organisms to perform respiration. And we manipulate the respiration, our independent variable, and we measure the release of carbon dioxide, our dependent variable. So just a little reminder of the difference between those two important variables for exams. Question 3. What is the purpose of the lime water? So that's an easy one. You've learned that it is an indicator, but it's not enough to just say it's an indicator. You have to say what it indicates. It indicates the presence of carbon dioxide. It tells us whether carbon dioxide is present or not. Question 4. Explain the purpose of wrapping test tubes 3 and 5 in black paper. So this could be a question for about 3 or 4 marks because it's an explain question. And you have to explain why it's important for these particular 2 test tubes to be wrapped in black paper. So the black paper is going to block any light, because remember, all of the test tubes are being exposed to light, but the black paper prevents that light from entering these specific 2 test tubes. Now, why would it be important to block the light in these 2 particular test tubes? Well, they both have a green plant in them. Why is that a problem? Because the green plant would photosynthesize if it were exposed to light instead of performing respiration. So photosynthesis would be the main chemical process taking place in that plant. If photosynthesis was happening, the plant would not be releasing carbon dioxide, but rather using it. And we want respiration to take place so that carbon dioxide may be released. So you see how that explanation works. Because the test tubes have plants in them, they would photosynthesize if they were exposed to light, which would have absorbed instead of released carbon dioxide. And then we cover them with a black paper to prevent the light from reaching the plant. Question 5. Explain the purpose of test tube 1. So this relates back to your understanding of scientific investigations in general. Test tube 1 has no animals or plants in it, but it does contain clear lime water. Because who's to say that lime water would not change into a milky white color regardless of whether there were organisms present? We need to know whether only living organisms are responsible for releasing carbon dioxide. So maybe the test tube's lime water would change just because it wants to. And we call this type of setup the control. Its purpose is to allow us to compare the results of test tubes 2 to 5 with it so that we can definitively say that it's the living organisms that are present, performing respiration and releasing carbon dioxide, responsible for changing the lime water. It's not just because lime water would naturally change into a milky color if no organisms were present. Okay, so here we have questions 6 to 8. So pause the video here, try to answer the questions yourself before we go through them together. Question 6. Consider the movement of gases and explain the importance of the permeable wire mesh and the cork stopper. So why do we need a permeable mesh in terms of gas movement? Remember that permeable means things can move through that barrier. So the clear lime water is situated below the organisms, and carbon dioxide produced by the living organisms needs to obviously get into that clear lime water. It needs to move down and dissolve in that clear lime water in order to change its color. If the organisms were stuck in a little compartment at the top, that carbon dioxide would collect in that compartment and it wouldn't reach the lime water to change its color. So a setup wouldn't be very effective that way. So the purpose of the permeable wire mesh is to allow carbon dioxide produced by the living organisms to move down into and dissolve in the clear lime water. Then in terms of the cork stopper, it creates a closed system, and we want that because we want to ensure a valid investigation. We don't want any additional gases coming into our experiment from the atmosphere, and we don't want any gases produced inside the test tubes from escaping it during our investigation. If the test tubes had no cork stoppers on them, then carbon dioxide that is naturally present in the atmosphere around us would drift into each test tube, dissolve in the clear lime water, and slowly change its color over time. And in that case, we wouldn't know whether the lime water changed a milky color because of the living organisms or because of something else. So then the investigation would be invalid. So, the cork stopper prevents gases from entering or leaving the test tube during the investigation. No carbon dioxide comes in from the outside, and no carbon dioxide exits the test tubes, thereby influencing our results. Question 7. After 12 hours, give the number or numbers of the test tube or test tubes where there will be the most carbon dioxide, the most oxygen, and no color change in the color of the lime water. So let's look at A, the most carbon dioxide. So when is carbon dioxide released? When respiration occurs. And when does respiration take place? All the time. So we're basically going to have respiration happening in all the test tubes where there are organisms present, test tubes 2 to 5. But where's the most carbon dioxide being released? So let's look at them one by one. In test tube 2, there are 2 beetles, and they will be releasing the amount of carbon dioxide released by 2 beetles. In test tube 3, there are 2 beetles as well as a plant. And because the test tube is covered with a black paper, all 3 of these organisms will be performing respiration and releasing carbon dioxide. So the plant is not exposed to light here and will also be releasing carbon dioxide. Test tube 4 is definitely out of our options. The plant will not be releasing carbon dioxide because the test tube is exposed to light, and therefore the plant will be performing mainly photosynthesis and actually absorbing the majority of the carbon dioxide. Test tube 5 is covered with a black paper, and the plant inside it will therefore not be photosynthesizing but performing respiration, and it will be releasing carbon dioxide equivalent to 1 plant. So if we then look at which test tube releases the most carbon dioxide, that will be test tube 3, which has 3 living organisms in it. Then in terms of where the most oxygen will be present, we've just gone through each of the test tubes and kind of discussed the expected results of them. And from our discussion, we excluded test tube 4 because we said that test tube contains a plant exposed to light. So that plant will actually be mainly performing photosynthesis and releasing oxygen. So the most oxygen will be present in test tube 4. And then question C, where there is no change in the color of the lime water, will be in any test tube where firstly no organisms are present, because then there's nothing to actually perform respiration and release carbon dioxide. So that means, test tube 1. Also, the clear lime water will not change color in any test tube where carbon dioxide is not being released but absorbed. In other words, where there is only a plant present that is exposed to light and therefore performing photosynthesis that absorbs carbon dioxide. So that is true for test tube 4. Question 8. Explain your answer in question 7c. Now, we've already done that as part of our reasoning to actually get to the answer, but note now that you've listed 2 test tubes. You've said the answers are test tube 1 and 4, so your explanation in question 8 has to be for both test tubes individually. So it can count a number of marks because you have to explain your reasoning for test tube 1 and test tube 4. So in the case of test tube 1, we said that there are no living organisms present, no respiration is therefore going to occur, no carbon dioxide will be released, and for that reason, the clear lime water stays clear. In the case of test tube 4, there is a green plant present, but it is exposed to light, which means that the plant will be performing mainly photosynthesis, and therefore the carbon dioxide in that test tube will not be released, but rather absorbed and used by the plant. So that's why the clear lime water will stay clear in that instance as well. Then the last 2 questions, 9 and 10, pause the video here, try to answer the questions yourself before going through them together. Question 9 asks you to describe the expected results for test tubes 2, 3 and 5. Now the question says that you need to describe the results in the test tube, which means that you don't have to provide long sentences of reasoning, you just need to describe what you would see. In other words, what would you see in the color of the lime water? So test tube 2, we're definitely going to see the clear lime water change to a milky color because there are only 2 living animals performing respiration. In test tube 3, we've already said that because the test tube is in the dark, the plant will be performing respiration together with the 2 beetles and thereby releasing a lot of carbon dioxide. So the clear lime water in test tube 3 will also turn a milky white color. And then in the case of test tube 5, the plant inside it will also be performing respiration because the test tube is covered with a black paper, and therefore the lime water in test tube 5 will also turn a milky white color. And then the last question says to list any 2 constant variables for this investigation. Now, right at the start, when we went through the setup, we actually already identified the constant variables for the test tubes. Remember, however, that because this question asks for 2 constant variables, that you can provide any 2 constant variables listed on the memo, but whoever marks your paper will be instructed to only mark the first 2 answers provided. So make sure that the first 2 answers you give are the ones you are most certain of. So here are the list of options for constant variables. The same sized test tubes have been used. All of them have the same amount of clear lime water in them. The test tubes should be left for the same amount of time before the results are checked. All of the test tubes are sealed. All of the test tubes make use of the same cork stopper. The same sized plant is used, and the same species of beetle should be used in test tubes 2 and 3. Now, importantly, when it comes to constant variables, you have to make sure that your answer is written as a phrase which in some or other way conveys the idea that something is being kept the same. So you can't just list the test tube, the lime water as your 2 answers. You would receive no marks because you're not saying what about the test tube or the lime water needs to be the same. In other words, the same sized test tube, the same amount of clear lime water. So please remember to write full sentences when answering variables, especially constant variables, to ensure that you've actually phrased your answer in a way that makes it a constant variable. If you found this video useful, give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new episodes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook to stay on top of the latest TAS news and launches. So that's it for now from the Answer Series, your key to exam success.